Hi, everyone. Okay, looks like we've still got a few people coming in. Okay, nice to see you all here. Shout out to my students. Thanks for being here, even when it's not mandatory for you. I'm Dr. Seth Ryan, and today I will be talking to you about both a recent study that I conducted and some lived experience I've had with this topic. It'll be somewhat interactive. I love questions, discussion, so please feel free at any point in time to put your questions in the chat. If you want to, have your video on, we'll get into a case study where we will be discussing how to apply this in clinical practice and what this looks like. If you'd rather leave your camera off, you are obviously more than welcome to do that too. But I just want you to feel totally free to say hey, I have a question about this, or can we get into this as the presentation goes on? And then I've also carved out some time at the end for questions and answers. So with that, I will start sharing my screen. Okay, bring everyone back. So this presentation is about something called intangible grief, and we're going to get into that. There we go. We'll do a brief introduction. We're going to get into the nitty-gritty around grief and loss, my positionality, the research findings, a case study, and hopefully some time to reflect. Okay, so when it comes to gender transition, oftentimes there's this really linear binary narrative that a person goes from the misery of dysphoria to the euphoria of transition and being affirmed in their gender identity. And it just really flattens a very nuanced and complicated experience of being trans, of what it means to transition. And so what we found and some parts of what I have experienced is that when trans clients express grief, loss, difficulty about their transition, that can be weaponized essentially by really well-meaning clinicians. I'm not talking about people acting in bad faith for the purpose of this presentation. I'm talking about allies, people who are trying, people who want to do the right thing might be confused by that, and it might turn into well, are you really trans, or can I really sign this letter for gender affirming care if I have any doubt? And that's a tall order to be certain that this is my identity. It is locked in, it's permanent, it's never ever going to change. That's not something we would require of pretty much anyone else on any other topic. And I think largely because people don't know how to hold that because it's not necessarily taught. If we think about how many trans people there are in the places where curriculum is being developed, where trainings are being developed, we've got a lot of allies and very few trans people to be able to speak to this experience. So I think that's just kind of the nature of it, and sometimes it gets missed. The flip side of that is the joy and euphoria of transition can often be treated as an end point. You've made it, you're done. This is sort of the finish line and you've crossed it. And that also serves to flatten a really complex narrative where people are still going to need support, maybe not on this specific thing anymore, but there's no real end point to transition. Oftentimes people get to a place where they're done with surgeries, or things like that, but there's not this real finish line. And so even that is really complicated to hold, where what a lot of trans people need, in my experience, is integration, is how do I make sense of all of this together and move forward with it? And so as counselors and counselor educators, we have to figure out how do we hold this dialectical space where grief and joy coexist, and they're not competing truths. They're just these different pieces that make up a whole. So transgender grief and loss specifically, what was really interesting when we started this study was that almost every study on the topic, if you were to put into any database, transgender grief and loss, almost all of them are going to be the grief and loss experienced by partners, by parents, by family members, by people who are in relationship with a transgender person and not the trans person themselves, which is kind of a big problem. That's one very niche aspect of the trans narrative, and that was actually really difficult to be with in the literature search and in pulling these studies, because it was, for me, there's essentially a lot of, counter transference of like anger and injustice of why aren't we also asking trans people themselves, what is this like for you, instead of just asking, the spouse, has it been like to lose your wife and gain a husband, or the parent to lose a son and gain a daughter, or things of that nature, which are important to explore. But it was eye-opening that there really were not studies investigating the intrapersonal experience from the trans perspective of what has grief and loss been like for you on the transition journey. I think this is also a somewhat taboo topic because of the socio-political landscape, and that people are really scared to talk about anything that might be weaponized by the more, right-wing side of things, by people who are trying to gatekeep access to care, that nobody really wants to say there are difficulties associated with transition, and it's not just all joyful and good and positive. There are also some really, really tough things to talk about. And so I do get that too, that there are other real world implications of why people might be afraid to go here. And so for this study, when we talk about grief and loss, there are different types of grief and loss, but the ones that I wanted to highlight as it came to us as a research team coming up with this term of intangible grief is, for starters, ambiguous loss. So ambiguous loss is maybe when a person is like physically present but psychologically absent. And so I have a lot of clients who will go no contact with, let's say, a parent. They had, an emotionally abusive parent or something like that. They no longer want to have that relationship. And so the parent is not dead, but they're also no longer in that person's life. And that would be an example of ambiguous loss, where there's grief, there's loss, but not in this traditional, like somebody is physically gone from this world kind of way. And this happens with all types of things, as we'll get into a little bit later. But through the lens of transition, there's a lot of ambiguous loss of things that like I once had and no longer do. Disenfranchised grief is the specific experience of grieving in where your grief is not acknowledged, validated, or supported by society. So an example of this would be losing your community or relationships after coming out, but it's the type of grief that you're not supposed to talk about. And so not only are you having this experience of grief and loss, you're also in a place where people don't want you to talk about it. Making things harder, right? It's like I need to deal with this. And so where do I put it? Where do I go with it? However, while disenfranchised grief is a part of transition, there was something more specific that we encountered in the study, and something that me as part of the only trans person on the research team had struggle articulating as we were going through some of our findings, where I just for a while couldn't put my finger on, like, this just doesn't feel exactly like what we're talking about. It's part of it, but there's something more to it. And so we came up with this term, intangible grief, which was pretty specific to the pain of a loss that is really abstract, invisible, in the transition process. And for most of our participants, that came from the mourning of these like what if kind of experiences, things I never got to have. Like I will never get to go back in time and get to play hockey with the boys in high school and be socialized as part of the team as a boy on the team, right? Like that's just something I'm never going to get to have. I'm also never going to get to have a certain future that I had envisioned for myself, even if it's like the path I don't want to walk. And that was something that came up with so many of our participants. And it really like intersected, especially with the disenfranchised grief, when it came to forced self-censorship to align with societal expectations. And so some of that would be like, if I played, let's say, field hockey in America, at least, that is predominantly a women's sport. How do I talk about playing softball or field hockey or something that's automatically going to be, oh, that you were part of a women's team, right? Or going to a women's college or something like that, having to navigate, ooh, do I share that with this person, or do I kind of withhold that if I don't want to get into a conversation about what that means, or who I am? And for a lot of the people in this particular study, there was this need to almost like hyper conform to gendered standards of femininity or masculinity to be treated with dignity and respect in their gender identity, where being gender nonconforming as a trans person often invoked questions of like, well, are you really trans? Or why would you need to transition if you're going to be a butch woman? Couldn't you just, stay a man, or things along that line? And so there was a lot of this, what I would term forced self-censorship. And so that's what really separated the intangible grief from ambiguous loss and disenfranchised grief, in that there's this dissonance between who someone is and the life that they are living or were allowed to live. Um, and it's often compounded by transmisia, the pressures of a cisgender heterosexual normativity, which can really like erase and invalidate these very, very nuanced experiences of grief. And so that was really what our study was about, was like, how does this present for you in your life? So for me, my positionality, my lived experience in interpreting this, I really struggled in finding not just a therapist, but definitely a therapist, but also like even just friends and other relationships where I had a space to talk about these kinds of things. And so when I decided to pursue transition, what I did before, right before starting hormone therapy, was I went on a women's only surf retreat. And a lot of people were really confused by that, of like, why would you do that if you're a man? That seems kind of like not right or something. And it was because I wanted to honor the girl and the woman who had carried me until that point in time in life. And I didn't want to feel like I was burying her or ignoring her, or just kind of like putting that up in a box to never be like spoken about again. I wanted to do something to honor her and to just have this really like meaningful experience of being in community with women. And that was something that I had to essentially stop talking about with people because of their reactions to it and their confusion by it. And that was hard because it was such a meaningful experience for me to be able to have that, to feel like I was sending her off peacefully rather than burying her alive. There was also, I have been asked by so many people in this really like nonchalant way of, so how's that white male privilege treating you? And like, that is just such a loaded question and loaded thing to say, because I'm definitely not negating that white men have privilege, but that is such a reductive approach to my actual experience, which has been in many ways profoundly like lonely and confusing. And it hasn't exactly felt like privilege. And anytime that I am treated with privilege, I'm hyper aware of the fact that it is predicated on that this person doesn't know I'm trans. And I don't know how they would respond if I'm cis. So it's actually like a really anxiety inducing experience to be acutely aware of the fact that you're passing, because then you don't know how somebody's going to respond to you. And I think that's especially dangerous and really brings in a lot of safety concerns for trans women. But for all of us, it's just like a really complicated thing. After I had top surgery, there was a lot of like, you must be so happy now, things must be so great. And it's like, I just had major surgery. I'm not great. Like, I'm still dealing with anesthesia. There's a lot of estrogen receptors in breast tissue. So I'm dealing with a pretty profound hormonal shift. I actually found a lot of community and comfort in people who have had double mastectomies, whether preventative or for breast cancer or whatever the issue was. It seemed like that was one of the few groups who really understood that hormonal and emotional shift after top surgery. And that was really difficult, because then it gets weird if you say that you're anything other than elated, but like, that's not how we would treat someone who just had their kidney removed or something. Like, you must be so happy now that that thing is gone. It's like, no, are you okay? You know, how are you doing? And so I have found that I'm certainly not alone in that experience with transition related procedures, where there's like not really a whole lot of nuance, that like, I had surgery. This is really complicated. This is really difficult. And so yes, on one hand I am happy, but on the other, there's like a whole lot of other stuff going on that I have to get used to, that overnight my body has changed, and that's still really jarring. And it might be what I want, but it's still something that is difficult to get used to and to deal with. For me personally, and a lot of other non-binary people, I felt a lot of pressure to present myself to, especially to medical professionals, in a really binary way in order to access care at all, but also to just be treated with respect and to not be questioned in like what I want or why I'm doing what I'm doing. And I've worked with so many non-binary people who have asked similar questions of like, do I just tell them this so that I can get access to hormones, or access to care? Because if I tell them that I'm fluid, or that like it shifts, or that I question, they're probably not going to write me that letter or write me that prescription, or whatever it is. I also had this really big struggle to embrace masculinity, which was connected to some of my loss of connection to queer spaces, in where I felt like I had become a predator or something like that. Like I transitioned, but in the wrong way, you know, not just to man, but to conventionally masculine kind of man. And that was really hard of how do I embrace something where there's a lot of narratives right now that this is all toxic and bad and harmful. And I basically am the patriarchy now. And like, what the hell do I do with that? Where do I put that? What is healthy masculinity? What is, you know, a positive expression of this? And that was really complicated to embrace. And then lastly, the pronoun sharing, where pronouns for me give you very little information about my gender identity and about my experiences, but I was acutely aware of the fact that I either share them and put myself in this box that kind of like undercuts the fluidity I feel in my identity, or I'm going to be potentially looked at as like, this is why all white men are problematic, which I don't want either. And so this has been a really anxiety provoking process of like, you know, is pronoun sharing liberatory, helpful to trans people? For some of them, yes. For others, no, but it always put me in this really uniquely vulnerable situation where there was like kind of this discrepancy between I'm like the one trans person here, and yet if I don't do this, I'm going to be seen as the problem. And how do I navigate that? And that has been really difficult to navigate on that level, but also on the level of feeling like I'm confined, I guess, to a certain box and have to synthesize my gender in a way that I don't experience it to articulate to someone else for their convenience. You know, this is who I am. And so that has been really complicated. So what we found in the research of like what came up for other people, for other trans people's experiences around grief and loss, were having to navigate shame and oppression, the intangible grief and loss that we talked about. There was a whole spectrum of emotions and coping strategies throughout transition. A lot of people, I think all of them, lost at least some kinds of relationships because they're trans. For a lot of us, having to navigate others' grief. So an example of this would be when I came out to my mom and told her that I was changing my name and then having to navigate her devastation about like rejecting the name she gave me and you know just all of this and then other family members being like, "Oh, can't you maybe just keep it as a middle name? It would mean so much to your mom." But really having to navigate other people's grief, which we also found reflected in the literature. And a lot of people found life meaning and purpose through advocacy as a response to the grief, loss, and oppression that they had experienced. And so that was really cool too, to see how they made meaning of what they went through. And I don't, you know, I either don't want this to happen to other trans people or I just wanted to do something with the anger and the injustice that I felt. And so I turned to advocacy as a way to put that into action. So some of the quotes from participants highlighting this theme of intangible grief and loss were, I'm a guy now, but I just never got the chance to be a boy and never got the chance to have a boyhood. I definitely mourned that a lot. It feels like there's this chunk of my childhood that's missing. And this was something that came up in different extents with all of our participants of they're mourning the things they didn't get to have. And I think it'll be really interesting to see if and how some of this shifts as more people are raising their children to have some space for exploration, for fluidity, for whether you're a girl or a boy, if you want to play football, that's fine with us. And to see how that kind of shapes these unlived experiences because they're always going to be there, but the extent in which they're associated or the intensity, I guess, with grief and loss, I imagine will kind of shift and vary as people grow up in more affirming and understanding environments. We have more vocabulary for these kinds of identities and experiences. Another one, it's hard to tell part of my story that I still hold very dear and true to me, like being a female athlete in college. As we get to know people and make friends, there's this kind of sadness that comes from, oh, I can't talk about that part. And it's very superficial. And this came up for a lot of people who were what people call stealth, where they're not out as a trans person. They're living in their gender, but a lot of the people around them don't know that they're trans and they don't really want them to know that they are trans. And so that puts them in a position of how do I navigate things like saying, oh, I was, you know, previously a female athlete, where it's like this little mini loss all of the time of I don't get to share that with other people. And there are these aspects of me that I have to keep private and just for me if I don't want to out myself or if I don't feel safe to out myself. Another one was I grieve the privilege of not having to deconstruct gender and having to work on that, just not having to think about things like this. And this one's huge. Like it is exhausting. It is a to do to have to think about like, who am I really, like at my core. And I read somewhere, I don't remember where, that we treat it was like the gender null hypothesis in that you're sort of cis until proven otherwise. And I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if we made cis people prove that they are cis in the way we make trans people prove that they are trans? Like if you're a cisgender woman who wants a breast augmentation, do you have to go get a letter proving to a therapist that like you are a cisgender woman, you really want these bigger breasts, you are never going to regret them, you promise, right? And it's like, that sounds kind of crazy. Well, yeah, because it is. And it is a privilege to not really have to like always be doing this deconstruction. And at least in the context of this quote and some of the other things that came up, it seemed very directly tied to like justifying and defending gender identity and transness. And then the last one here, this was a big one that came up, was when I came out, I had to give up my safe space as a woman. I'm a white, hetero, seemingly man. I hate being this, but I had to give that up and lose the community. I realized that I was no longer a woman and that I was now going to be a white male, and I will never be able to smile at a woman coming out on the street without making that person uncomfortable. I lost the ability to do that, to be a kind stranger. And that was something specifically with trans men that came up over and over, was this loss of being a safe person and moving into being treated automatically like a threat. And we've all had the experience of like why that happens. Like intellectually, we understand what's happening, but the embodied experience of that is really painful and really difficult to deal with. And the only community that came up again and again from different participants and in different ways was the lesbian community specifically, and how much grief and loss there was tied to losing, that identity, losing that community, feel or at other times feeling pushed out by that community. But I thought it was really interesting that there was no other like community, no other queer identity that was talked about as much by participants as the lesbian community. And I think that it was reflective of the kinds of social connections and ties that women specifically have to each other. And for a lot of the trans men, it came up as like there was just nothing on the other side of that. It's not like I went from this women's space to this men's space. I went from this women's space to nothing, and really grieving that. And so I do wonder, what would this have looked like if men had more, spaces and more emotional and social connections like that? And it was more like I went from a women's space to a men's space. Still wouldn't have vibed well for all of our non-binary people who don't necessarily feel comfortable in either, but for the more binary trans people who were specifically grieving that, I do kind of wonder what that would have been like. And on the flip side, there were several trans women who talked about feeling really embraced and like they finally had a sense of community and camaraderie, and they had sort of transitioned into the sisterhood in this really beautiful way. So I just wanted to name that explicitly because it was something as the research team that we really had to reflect on, of like, how do we talk about this? Because lesbians came up so much that we can't not say that in the research, but we also want to be really mindful of like how we talk about this, because it was so loaded and so complicated for a lot of people, and kind of directly how that reflects broader concepts that we've seen about men and women and the way that they relate to each other. Okay, so this is where I wanted to spend some of our time talking and being a little bit more interactive. I've just given you all of this information, which I feel like leaves us with the question of, that's great. What do we do with this? And so I have developed a case study that I wanted. Oh, and I've also got, I'm like not the best at monitoring the chat. Let's see. Oh, I'm glad that you get to do the letters. Okay, wait. Okay. And yes, you can have a copy of the slides at the end of the presentation, and I'll try to do better at monitoring the chat. Um, so from here, I did want to move us into a case study and spend the majority of the rest of our time talking about what does this actually look like in practice and what can we do. I didn't want to come with just a problem for you all. I also wanted to really spend some time reflecting on the solutions or the action we can take to address what we found to be a problem in the literature. So for this case study, we've got Eli, a 28-year-old trans man, shares that he's missing the camaraderie and physicality of playing women's rugby in college. He says that was the only time I ever felt like I really belonged. I don't feel that anymore, not even in trans spaces. Eli speaks warmly about his time on the team, but adds, I know I've gained a lot by transitioning, but it also feels like I gave up everything. My community, my family, my role, my voice, my place. Some days I wonder if it was worth it. I know that I can't really go back, and I'm not sure if I want to, but sometimes I do. And so I wanted to hear from you all of what you think would be some helpful and unhelpful responses to this in therapy. Or if you're a supervisor, you can talk from that lens. But if this was your client in front of you, let's start with what you think would be an unhelpful response. You can either just unmute yourself or maybe throw something in the chat.
I would say an unhelpful response would be something like, well, I'm sure that will happen for you in time.
Someone else said unhelpful, bypassing the emotional expression here.
What was the question again? I'm sorry.
What would be some unhelpful responses? The do nots, as far as this case study goes, starting there. Another example was gaslighting comments and no empathy. Yanina, did you want to share what might be a gaslighting comment? Like, what do you mean by that?
Would say something along the lines that really belittle his feelings. So maybe something sort of like, well, wait, I know you gave one. Let me read his quote real quick, his statement. Mm, Just saying like, oh, that's okay. Um, you have yourself and you've gained a lot, and just focusing on that rather than the grief that he's experiencing.
Yeah, kind of like
You
silver
have,
lining it.
Mhm.
I think
Really
also,
inaccurately.
oh,
Go ahead, Nakona.
I was just gonna say, I think also being very like, well, you weren't really yourself when you were playing rugby, like in totally not validating the feelings that they have whatsoever.
Yeah, questioning like, was that really yourself? Absolutely.
I was going to say the exact same thing. Yeah.
Liz, are you gonna share anything too?
Or I think on the other side of that, the kind of feeling sometimes personal bias come up, and then so it's like reflecting back really inaccurately that is being, and it's almost like hiding a microaggression. That sounds silly maybe, but this idea of like, right, so oh, so it sounds like, this is something you might be regretting now, and which is incredibly uh disabling to that person in the moment.
Yeah, like a superimposition of meaning, that like this is now being reduced to regret. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Another comment in the chat was a gaslighting shame-based comment of you should be grateful for who you are today, which I think follows along those same lines. Yeah, absolutely. Something that we heard from some of the participants was therapists asking then like, well, are you really trans? Would be another example of an unhelpful response and put someone immediately into a defensive mode where they have to defend their identity. Anything else? What would be some helpful? Oh, sorry. Was someone going to say
No, I was
something?
gonna. This is something I really like this because I'm dealing with this with a lot of individuals I work with. But would a helpful thing saying, um, what kind of support system do you have around you, or do you know of anybody that has gone through the same transition that you've gone through, that you can talk to, or um, I don't know if that's something that would be helpful, to ask that, and maybe dig deeper into her past friends or people that she did play sports with, and maybe help her get connected to someone else that is has gone through the transition, and because honestly, I would think there would be a level of loneliness there too, for
Yeah.
sure. And so, and I think all of us individuals, when we're going through stuff like this, big transitions in our life, need, it's great to have a community to fall back on. And so helping her get plugged in there would be a helpful thing. And also be there. Hey, I'm there with you. I'll be there side by side. But also know that I don't understand it because I'm not trans, but I want to know more about it. I want to know your experience, how you are feeling, that type of stuff.
Yeah, community is huge. So who are you in community with? Where do you, get to belong? I think if someone says, I don't feel like I belong anywhere anymore, that's a great opening and invitation to explore where could you maybe find a sense of belonging? Are there things that you want to explore either in local community, if you're maybe somewhere rural or somewhere where there's not going to be a lot of other trans people? We've got the beauty of the internet these days where there are lots of online communities. We could do a little bit of both, but yes, absolutely. I do think community is hugely important for basically all clients and all human beings. But especially when you're in a place of, I don't know that I belong anywhere. I think we all know the power of representation is huge. And so you don't have to be a trans counselor to work with trans people. And even if you are, you're not that person's friend. You're not exactly that person's community. And so where can they find that in their day-to-day lives and have connections that will outlast the therapeutic process? Absolutely. And we also had a comment saying that to acknowledge that it's normal to grieve a lost sense of community because it's something we all wish for and need. Like at its core, this is a very basic human thing of we all want. 99.9% of us probably all want somewhere to belong and to have that sense of community and companionship and belongingness that this, while there are like trans specific layers to this, I do think the core of it is a very, very human. We would all be grieving that and on some level can probably all relate to that.
On the side of like helpful things, I'm not entirely sure this falls under it, but I'm curious like what you think if this would be a helpful question asking like what did it feel like when you belonged and like how like long of a process was it to get there to feel like belonging? Um, to kind of like see if they can compare their like past experience with like something that they want to like implement in the future.
Yeah, I love that because that also kind of puts in perspective that belongingness isn't something that happens overnight either, especially like if we're talking about a team sport, you're not typically like a cohesive team that you all feel the sense of belongingness together on day one. That's something that also takes time to develop. And yes, so I would be really curious about like, well, what was that like for you? How did that develop over time? Do you have anything parallel in your life now? I think would all be really interesting paths to explore and might help reframe depending on what they were thinking was going into it of like, oh, maybe I wanted to have this overnight, but I haven't necessarily been laying the groundwork to build that kind of community or foster those kinds of connections, and now I have something that I can like do and put into action to help that. Absolutely.
I think where my mind went is I've worked a lot with grief and grief counseling, but not so much in this capacity. But one of the things that I think could be helpful is just um, acknowledging that loss and that the idea that we all experience this to some degree, but really sitting in those emotions. And if Eli didn't perhaps do kind of a ritual of letting go of the woman that carried him to this point, like you talked about, maybe implementing that in the session, like planning a release session of whatever that is, and being really experiential with it, and letting them know that that's okay to have that space to grieve what is a loss and still be okay with the decision.
Yeah, I really like both sides to what you said because I think like for me, and I'm very existential in my approach, that I feel like a lot of my work is bearing compassionate witness to what's going on for people. Like I'm not always here to try to solve this or put this into action. Sometimes I'm simply here to witness it and to be with you in the pain of this, in the profound loss. and not immediately moving into how can I fix or solve this for you. I think that's something a lot of us as therapists struggle with because we want to help. We want to feel useful, right? Like that makes me feel good when I feel like I'm doing my job, when I'm making an impact. And it is much harder for me to be there in the like, that sucks, sort of end of sentence. Like this just sucks. This is so hard. This is so difficult. This is so heartbreaking. And to be with that, I do think, yes, that is a really profound for a lot of people to have that kind of pain, that kind of loss simply acknowledged and to not be shied away from and to really just kind of feel and experience it with a client. And on the other hand of that, Liz had also made a comment in the chat that I think goes on those same lines of how do we honor that part of you and what might that look like? And maybe that is some kind of like special session or ceremony. Maybe it's something else. I don't know. It would largely depend on the client and what they want. But I love that question of like, how can we honor that part of you and how do we bring some of that into the present today? How do we integrate that? I love that too. Any other thoughts, Brittany?
You know, I'm a first year graduate student. So, from my perspective, when I'm reading this, I think if someone were to present in one of my practicum hours, with this, what would I do? And because I don't have a lot of experience yet, my first thought is exactly what you just said. Go back to the basics, right? If I'm listening to this, I'm supposed to validate where they're coming from. It just seems very natural to me to validate when you're hearing emotions that are this powerful from someone, to validate what they're feeling and then reflect back to what you're hearing, right? That there's so much loss there. There's grief. There's a search going on in themselves, and to reflect back in those things, just going back to the basics of what we learned in the beginning, seems like you can't really go wrong with that.
Yeah, I love that you said that. I feel like most of us have had times where you get stuck and it's like all of a sudden I don't know what to do. And sometimes I need to be reminded to just go back to the basics, lead with curiosity and compassion, and I'll find my way, back during the session again. Absolutely. We also had a comment of being sensitive to the varying length and intensity of grief and its acknowledgement could be helpful. Grief is unique to every person in their experience. So maybe you could guide a conversation of what healing might look like for Eli and do some goal setting around self-care or tangible tasks that might provide an option for active work on that grief. And I love that. I have found like anecdotally in my work, but I think there's some literature that reflects this too, is that especially male clients, and this is like, I don't want to put all men and women into boxes, but I have found that a lot of my male clients want something to do. It's like, how can I give me something tangible, something concrete? Thank you for the insight, but I really need something to like sort of do with my hands. And so that's obviously not limited to men, but I have just found it to be more often the case with them, including trans men. And so exploring with your client of like, do we want something, to tangibly do, we can move into some goal setting of like, yes, I have acknowledged this and been with this. And what do we want to do with it from here? What would something look like? Kind of along those lines. And I've had more than one client who's sort of scared to give themselves permission to cry or to feel because they feel like, well, if I start, I'll never stop. And so one of my favorite things to do has been like scheduled crying timers of like, you don't have to cry if it doesn't happen, but at this time, you're going to put on like a 5-minute timer. And that's the boundary you have for it to be like, okay to cry. And we go through what are you going to do before and after that so that, they have a way to get like regulated again. And for a lot of them, it's usually like a walk in a park or something like something physical that they'll do at the end of the 5 minutes to come back to a regulated place. And we'll carve that out. And it has been so helpful for so many of my clients to have like, I had this boundaried concrete box and it was like my first sort of dipping a toe into just letting myself feel and losing some of the fear that once I start, I'll never stop because we've really like boundaried that up really well and put some sort of walls around it where I felt like I had the tools and the skills to be in that, but then to also come back out of that, I have found hugely helpful. That could look for your clients any number of different ways. But yeah, finding like really small ways of how do we be with this grief in a way that's not going to overwhelm you, not going to set you into crisis, not going to completely like flood your nervous system. What kind of coping skills do we need to develop on both sides of that, of being really intentional before and after whatever you engage with? And I have found so many of my clients have come back really appreciative of like, thank you for giving me something to do with this. And that really helped me stop the dissociation or stop avoiding and kind of denying this. So yeah, I absolutely love that. Anything else that we haven't covered before we kind of move down this list?
Seth, I hope this isn't jumping ahead, but when the counseling education equipping you to feel competent in addressing this, I think that informs the other three questions, because I would say oftentimes our counseling education doesn't even prepare us to be competent in addressing regular grief. Like we get some training in it, but often they're electives, or we don't maybe deal with our own issues around grief or death anxiety. And so then to even focus it down into such a niche type of grief, um, I would question whether any of us were truly adequately prepared to feel 100% competent in addressing it, and maybe how um, presentations like this and research like this then would inform how we are educated about it.
Yeah, I'm really curious about that, to hear from other people, because I know we've got kind of a mix of people who are master students, doctoral students, or out in the field and kind of done with their educations of like, how do you feel about this? This is the case vignette we've got in front of you. Somebody says, this is your client, this is what happened in the intake session. I would love to know if anyone else wants to share. Do you feel like you have been equipped to, maybe not 100% competence, but do you have, I don't know, 90, 75%? Like, do you have enough to feel like you would at least know how to move forward with this client, and then, get some supervision after that, but feeling like you wouldn't maybe have a panic attack to at least try to broach that on your own first?
Well, can I ask this question? With the
Yeah.
grief process, I mean, this is sort of like I work in addiction a lot. And so how I look at it too is those people that are getting out of it is loneliness, but it's also like losing a loved one. It's like losing something that's so close and so personal to you. And I think in this situation, it's sort of the same type of grief. You see what I'm getting at? It's like this is a major issue. Um, so would you approach it in that same sense, sort of, hey, I understand, or finding other people that have experienced the same grief within the community that you can work with, you can talk to, and also, encourage that as well with a client, that if you're not, I'm not trans, but, encourage them to find someone else to work with that grief with that has been exactly where you've been. You see what I'm getting at? It's like, I know what addiction is because I'm a recovered addict. So I'm able to meet them where they're at. So, I don't know. That's just a question. It's That's throw it out there.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of parallels, and that the council, especially like CACREP accredited counselor education curriculums, is really all I can speak to from my own experience and knowledge. I do think there's a lot more concrete education on addressing recovery, addiction, and what will be helpful through that process. But even, at least in my own experience, there wasn't a whole lot covered on like the grief of, for myself, of like, it is, while addiction didn't serve me in any way, I've been in recovery for almost 13 years now. There are still like aspects of that I miss, even though I know it wasn't like helpful or the path that I was meant to be on. And I can't say that even like my counselor education program or other things that I've done really prepared me to deal with like the very niche and specific nuance of that. But I absolutely can see a lot of parallels in what you just said, Donnie.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Do you feel like you would be, oh, we've got Laura put something in the chat. I began clinical counseling, was licensed in 2008. I did not feel prepared for the field. And I can be honest that this would have been a really tough case for me as an entry-level counselor. I have learned more from the continuing education I've had, experience, and good supervisor. Thank you for sharing that with me, Laura. I mean, this would be a tough case for me as not a new counselor. That I found I had been a counselor for quite a while when I started working with trans people specifically. And even at that point, like these were really tough cases. And so I'm glad that you've learned more from the continuing education and the supervisors. And for those of you still in school right now, the education doesn't stop when you graduate. Hopefully it just gets more specific and deepens into something more meaningful to what you're actually practicing. But yeah, I did write this specifically to hopefully be a challenging case that would really make you all kind of critically reflect on like, do I feel, genuinely adequately prepared by my education to be with this?
I just wanted to weigh in on the idea that every trans person doesn't transition, but then also that they transition at different times in their lives. So the experience is so very unique to the person, and depending, I think, on the time in their life, whether they're much younger, especially that this experience of finding community could be more or less difficult, right? Like if you're a younger person, do you have more time as the person that you are to build that community as opposed to transitioning later in life? Not having that time, right? That people around you know you for who you are.
Yeah, I think there's both the question of time and also the generational cultures that the younger people tend to have more. There's just more trans and queer people and more acceptance of that the sort of younger you go on the generational scale. And so an older person isn't just up against time, they're also up against, who in my generation do I have? There's just by the nature of it, like less of them. And I think that's a really hard place to be too. You make a good point that not every trans person transitions. There are a lot of reasons why someone may or may not pursue at least medical transition. Maybe they socially transition, but don't like legally or medically transition. I had a client, one of my favorite, most complicated clients was in his late 70s when he came to work with me and had been essentially cross-dressing for years throughout his marriage. He had been married longer than I've been alive. So it was like, for me, a lot of imposter syndrome of you want me, to like help you with this and wanted help coming out to his wife, but very clearly did not want to make, a full medical legal transition, just wanted her to share in that with him sometimes. And he had a different persona, different name, different pronouns for this other like side of him, but very much wanted to keep that to himself. He would do these like really cool photo shoots sometimes when they would go on trips. And we got to integrate different aspects. Like he bought all of these different colored Keds to have little pops of color that like reminded him of her in his daily life. And for me, it was just like it was hard for me. It challenged a lot of the things I've learned and a lot of the notions and kind of like biases that I had as the therapist of like, oh, there are so many ways to be trans, to not transition. Some people try to transition and have medical complications from hormone replacement therapy or surgeries or other medical interventions and then can't continue. Where does that leave them? And I just did a presentation on detransition, where there are a lot of people, the vast majority of detransitioners are not trying to gatekeep gender affirming care on Fox News. That's like 5 of them. But the rest of them just kind of landed in a different place in their transition where we don't really know where Eli would end up. But I think a lot of us, I know for me and a lot of my other therapy friends in the field of gender affirming care, it's really scary to broach something like detransition, even when you're doing it in good faith and just trying to be neutral of like, is that something that you're considering or exploring? And just having genuine curiosity about that, I think is also really hard for people. And that, I mean, detransition is its own presentation, but I do think with what Eli has shared, there's a possibility of like, is that something you're considering? That doesn't mean you'll pursue it or not, but do you want a space to talk about that and what that might be like and what that would look like and where do you kind of want to go from here? I know there were other questions on this slide, but we're almost out of time. So I did want to make sure I came to this slide with some practical recommendations. We've already talked about most of these, of normalizing this, trying to avoid that very linear binary assumption and framework, not pathologizing our clients, being really curious about their experiences. And I think very importantly, make the time and space for your own biases, assumptions, and countertransference. We all have them. It doesn't make you a bad person. It doesn't make you a transphobe, but you do need to reflect on that and be aware of that and do something with that. If you're an educator or a supervisor, we want to be able to like model that kind of complexity and nuance. We want to explicitly name systems of oppression, and most importantly, helping counselors in training move through moral injury of at times you're going to get it wrong, you're not going to have the resources, the systems are going to be working against you. Things are just going to be, whenever you're an ally to a group, there's the moral injury of realizing that you've done something harmful or that you were uninformed or unaware. And how do you move through that discomfort? That's a really difficult process. And so I think that's something as educators and supervisors, we want to, be aware of, and just some common missteps over there that I think we've already spent enough time talking about. I hope that there's at least one thing you learned today that you'll be able to bring into your clinical or teaching practice. And with our 1 minute or so left, if there are any like final questions, I'm happy to chat, but also this is my email address if anyone wanted to follow up more directly. So any final, I got time for like one question or thought if anyone wants to come in with anything.
All right, I'll do it. I'm wondering if you have any advice for younger trans persons who don't have access to counseling. If you have any advice for their parents or
Yeah.
someone who's an ally.
Yeah, my advice really echoes what I think it was Donnie shared earlier of where can you find community? Where do you have safe and affirming spaces to be yourself? And for some people, that's maybe only in their like school counselor's office or their therapist's office. For young people specifically, remind them they have a school counselor, but you'd want to kind of vet that and make sure that school counselor is actually going to be a safe person. But there are a lot of K-12 like school specific resources that they might have access to, but really, where do you have some community? Where do you get to be yourself? So many of my young trans clients are tabletop gamers, and I know of so many trans specific D&D campaigns. So like if they're into that, but yes, I would really kind of bring it back to where do you have community? Where do you have meaningful connections? Where do you have role models? Just where do you have those safe people in your life where you get to express yourself and be with yourself? Because I think with or without therapy, there's something really innately healing about just being able to be yourself while in community with others. Even if that's only one or two other people, we want to amplify those one or two people where you really get to have that and not shy away from the importance of that. So thank you everyone for being here. I'm reading some comments. Thank you so much, everybody. Oh, we've got a dungeon master in the room. I love this. See, I told you, all the gays and trans people, they just love D&D. Like, I don't know what it is. So D&D is like one of my recommendations. And if your community has a queer center too, that's also a place I would look into. So yeah. Well, thank you, everyone. I don't want to keep you. You are welcome to stay here. Eventually you'll be put back into the waiting room by our monitor. I'm going to stop the